Now, Teicholz, there's been, in these proceedings, much has been said about the adult dietary guidelines not being applicable to children and no guidelines for children below 2 years, etc. But given what you said about the relationship between the diet-heart hypothesis and the dietary guidelines, what has your research revealed in respect of the diet-heart hypothesis, the dietary guidelines in respect of restricted fat intake and the influence on children's diets?
Yes. Okay. So what about children? Children are clearly of special concern. They have different nutritional needs. They're growing. They're vulnerable, and they have little or no choice about what they eat. Starting in 1970, the American Heart Association extended its advice from men and women to all children over the age of 2. That was when it started with children. And then when the U.S. government, when we started our dietary guidelines, it also included all children over the age of 2. What was the rationale for including children in advice for basically designed for middle-aged people to avoid heart disease? Why was that advice applied to children, healthy growing children? The compelling logic for including children was that it went back to German researchers in the 1920s who had found fatty streaks in the arteries of children. It was assumed that if those fatty streaks were left unchecked, those streaks and lesions would inevitably lead to the fatal disease. This is in my book on page 147. So that the National Health, the NHLBI, which is the part of the National Institute of Health that deals with heart disease, in the late 1960s was putting children as young as 4 years old on cholesterol-lowering drugs. Quite a few experts challenged this approach, including a top NIH official. In 1971, what evidence do we have that an egg yolk a day spells jeopardy for all Americans? Are we convinced of the safety of this diet containing 10% of polyunsaturated, those are vegetable oils, to the extent that we want to insist on this in a baby's formula? And I just want to read another challenge at an NIH consensus conference. Researchers in 1984, researchers and doctors expressed concern that no trial had ever been conducted to test a low-fat diet, a diet low in fat or saturated fat on children. There is absolutely no evidence that it's safe for children to be on a cholesterol-lowering diet, said Thomas C. Chalmers, former president of the Mount Sinai Medical Center. He told that to Science magazine. I think that the NIH leaders made an unconscionable exaggeration of all the data. But the NIH and the American Heart Association pressed the American Academy of Pediatrics to accept their position. The American Academy of Pediatrics, they're doctors, they treat children, and they knew what children, they sort of resisted this advice. They said, children are different. In an editorial published in the American Academy of Pediatrics journal, Pediatrics, in 1986, this is in my book on page 148, the group's nutrition committee said that any change towards a more restrictive diet in the first 2 decades of life should await demonstration that such dietary restrictions are needed. And they emphasized the differences in the nutritional needs of growing children, especially during the growth spurt of adolescence, compared to those of middle-aged men with high cholesterol. Quote, the proposed changes would affect consumption of foods currently providing high-quality proteins, iron and calcium, and other minerals essential for growth. They thought that high-quality proteins were in animal foods. You have to understand that, the original nutrition science looked at, in the 1920s and 30s, before Ansel Keys, the question in nutrition science was this question asked for humans, the questions that you ask for any animal. How do you ensure healthy growth and reproduction? That's the survival of the species. And so there was a scientist, this McCollum, Elmer V. McCollum, who studied this. And he studied this by studying rats, who are omnivore animals, and feeding them, like us, like humans, omnivore animals, and feeding them all different kinds of diets. he found it was easier to keep rats healthy by feeding them milk, eggs, butter, organ meats, and green leafy vegetables, and so he came to call those foods protective, because they supported healthy growth and reproduction for the omnivorous animal. He tried keeping rats alive on vegetarian diets, but he found that they would only grow to half their size, and it required enormous work to get exactly the right balance of oats and grains and seeds and wheat in order to get them to grow. And even then, the growth in the first and second generation of life was not sufficient. And for many years, children, in order to recover from illness and growth retardation, they were fed butter, whole milk, cod liver oil to protect them from infection. Those were considered healthy and protective foods. In the 1980s, parents all over the world got on board with the low-fat diet. They swapped whole milk for reduced fat milk. They restricted the intake of eggs, and the concerns of pediatricians were drowned out by advocates for the low-fat diet, the government, and the media. Parents succumbed to this, not realizing that the scientific evidence for their choices was virtually non-existent. It had never been based on any evidence at all. It had always been based on that speculative idea about fatty streaks in the arteries and how they might develop into heart disease later in life. So, as I've said, when we adopted the low-fat diet for children, there were no randomized controlled clinical trials looking at the nutritional adequacy of that diet for children. And since then, 2 trials alone have been conducted. One is called the Dietary Intervention Study in Children, DISC. It was NIH funded on 300 7 to 10-year-old children on a diet low in fat and saturated fat. It was not a normal population. Those children were selected because they had excessively high LDL-C levels, and they're probably reflecting some kind of genetic abnormality. It was not a normal population, and therefore probably not generalizable to a general population. They found out that the children grew equally well on the low-fat diet, but they were deficient in a large number of vitamins and minerals, calcium, zinc, vitamin E, and they got less magnesium, phosphorus, vitamin B12, because of course vitamin B12 is only found in animal foods, thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, compared to the control group. And importantly, they saw no improvement in any of their cardiovascular risk factors. So the whole aim of that diet, which was to try to improve the cardiovascular risk of those children, there were no benefits, which was the aim of the study. The second trial was in Finland on babies up to the age of 3. Breast milk was replaced by non-fat milk after 1 year. It was a loosely controlled trial, which means that they didn't visit the parents very often, and they weren't so much in control of the diets, and they provided vitamin supplements, so that avoided the question of nutritional sufficiency. And the results were that there was no difference in growth or height, but that HDL-C, which is the good cholesterol, went down in the group that had the lower fat diet. That's consistent. You see that in all low-fat trials, which means that an indicator that your risk of heart disease is going up. So in sum, there had been 2 trials tested on only 800 children, 300 of whom could not be called representative because they had singularly high LDL cholesterol. The rest were under the age of 3, and the children were not followed into adulthood, so reproductive consequences could not be studied. Based on that small, irregular sample, it seemed unconscionable to counsel millions of normal American children of all ages to change their diets. In addition, since children began to be put on a low-fat diet, there has been quite a lot of research, and what they've discovered is that there's no solid evidence to claim that lowering serum cholesterol in children has any impact on their future risk of heart disease. Most of those fatty streaks do not become dangerous fibrous plaques. A child's diet is completely unrelated to the appearance of those streaks in the first place. Instead, it seems to be the lipid profile of the mother that's the main determinant. and lowering dietary fat, as we've seen, did not have a meaningful effect on blood lipids. The Cochrane collaboration, which is considered the premier systematic review group in the world, they're based in the United Kingdom, they did a review in 2001, and they concluded avoiding fat could not be shown to prevent heart disease in normal children or even in children with a genetic predisposition to heart disease. It's also been shown that the low-fat diet cannot help children lose weight, which is the same finding that we found in adults. The low-fat diet seems ineffective to reduce body fat. This is a huge school-based trial that was done and funded by the NIH. And then there's the question, does this conventional advice harm children? One of the really, truly shocking things that I found when I read through the Dietary Guideline Expert Report is that by its own admission, it's nutritionally insufficient. It is the nutrients for which adequacy goals are not met in almost all of the dietary patterns are potassium, vitamin D, vitamin E, and choline. This is their own words. There's also an underconsumption of the essential nutrients, vitamin D, calcium, and potassium. There are public health concerns for a majority of the U.S. population, but the dietary guidelines do not solve that problem. In order to meet the only way that we get our adequate amount of iron and folate is to recommend 3 to 5 servings of refined grains every day. Okay, so that's things like refined breakfast cereals. And that's because only refined grains in the U.S. are fortified and enriched with iron and folate. So the dietary guidelines, even though they tell people to eat whole grains, is in the very awkward position of continuing to recommend an equal amount of refined grains because otherwise the whole population would be deficient in iron and folate. Even though iron and folate, if you eat them in cereal, they're not as bioavailable, according to quite a few studies, as if you eat them from their natural food sources, which are meat and liver, organ meats. The benefits are that, or they're hypothesized that fats are the conveyors of fat-soluble vitamins. A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble vitamins. They can only be absorbed if they're consumed with fat. So if a child is drinking non-fat milk, they are not consuming those vitamins. So a scientist named Andrew Prentice hypothesized that the lack of a high-fat animal food diet was possibly, quote, the major contributor to growth failure, unquote, among babies that he was studying in Gambia. The increased consumption of fat after weaning at 6 months was associated with continued gains in height, and he presented these results at a major symposium in Houston in 1998, and other studies had similar results. There were studies that were reported from all over the world about children growing better on higher fat diets from Western and non-Western countries. But in the summary statement from the symposium that was prepared by an American academic with close ties to the NIH and both the DISC and the STRIP studies that I discussed, they failed to mention the greater good health and height gains associated with higher fat diets that had been the subject of many of the conference papers.